They kicked in the door at 3 a.m., posing as HOA officers and demanding fake debts from an unsuspecting family. What they didn't expect was to face off against a retired Navy SEAL and a father. Armed with nothing but truth, discipline, and a shotgun, Jackson Riley turned their intimidation into national outrage. But just wait until you hear how this standoff ended, and why justice, in the end, didn't just knock. It kicked back. The sound ripped through the night like thunder. Not a dream, not a movie. Real. Wood splintered. Something heavy crashed to the floor downstairs. Then a voice, his mother's, sharp and terrified. "Jackson!" A high-pitched whimper followed from the other end of the hallway. That was Katie, his little sister. And then silence. For a second, time froze. Andy shot up in bed, heart hammering. His room was dark, except for the soft blue glow of the clock. 3:02 a.m. He sat motionless, breath locked in his chest. The house had been still, quiet until now. Then came more noise. Boots on tile, barked orders, flashlights cutting through the shadows. "HOA, open up! This is the Homeowners Association!" A man shouted from below, his voice cracked with fake authority. Andy blinked. What? That made no sense. Homeowners Association? At 3 in the morning? With flashlights and weapons? The banging started again. Not at the door this time. It had already given way, but against walls, furniture. Heavy footsteps moved through the first floor like a storm. One of them yelled something about unpaid fees and legal entry, but it was jumbled, like someone rehearsing lines from a bad play. Andy's father was already up. Jackson Riley wasn't the kind of man to wait and see. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. He moved. Shirtless, barefoot, with his old Mossberg in hand, he stepped out of the master bedroom and moved to the top of the stairs. Jackson was a retired Navy SEAL, 20 years deployed. He'd been through door breaches in deserts and jungles. He'd heard the sound of steel meeting steel, of adrenaline cutting through sleep. This was different. This was home. And someone had crossed the line. At the bottom of the stairs stood 3 men, heavy jackets, military-style pants. One wore a badge clipped to a vest, cheap plastic, the kind you find at costume shops. Their faces were hard to see under the glare of flashlights they aimed directly up toward Jackson. "You're trespassing," Jackson said calmly. His voice didn't shake. "You're not law enforcement. Get out, now." One of them laughed. "We're with HOA enforcement. This property has unresolved violations. You've been warned." Jackson's fingers tightened slightly around the grip of his shotgun, but he kept it lowered. "That's not how this works," he said. "You broke into my house. At 3 in the morning. There are kids upstairs. Turn around and no one gets hurt." They didn't listen. Andy, still frozen at the edge of his bed, could see the stairwell from his room. The shadows danced. He saw the back of his father, tall, unmoving, a wall between them and everything below. He heard another step, a click, something electrical, not a gun, a device. Then came a low buzz. A man lifted a black tool, small, metallic, a stun device. He aimed directly at Jackson's chest. Andy's breath stopped. A pop, a hiss. Wires shot out, piercing the dark. A sharp zap broke through the air, followed by a grunt. Jackson dropped to one knee. The gun hit the floor with a thud, his hands clenched at his sides. But he didn't fall. Andy's chest filled with something new, not fear, not even panic, something hot, heavy, the kind of emotion that didn't shake. It burned. Katie whimpered again. Their mother shouted, "Leave us alone," from down the hall. Andy snapped out of his daze, scrambled to the floor and grabbed his phone. His fingers fumbled across the screen. 911. He pressed call. Downstairs, one of the men stepped closer to Jackson, now on one knee, but still towering in presence. Another yelled, "Search the house! Get what we came for!" Jackson spoke again, teeth clenched. "Last warning," he said, voice low, edged with steel. "This is my house." But the imposters didn't care. They moved deeper inside. Flashlights roamed across family portraits, kitchen counters, couch cushions. One kicked the dog's food bowl, scattering kibble across the floor like trash. Another ripped open the hall closet. Andy watched everything through the railing upstairs. His fingers tightened around the phone, and then something changed in his father's stance. Even down on one knee, stunned and breath short, Jackson Riley was calculating. Training didn't vanish just because the years passed. He had one more move, and it was already set in motion. This wasn't over, not even close. Jackson hit the floor hard, his right knee cracking against the wood, but his grip on the shotgun didn't loosen. The taser's jolt had done its work, sent lightning through his spine, and short-circuited every muscle fiber for a beat or two. But it hadn't broken him, not even close. He steadied his breathing, forced his gaze upward. The three men, whatever they were pretending to be, stood in a loose formation, still shouting commands like actors in a bad cop drama. He could fire. He should fire. Every instinct born from decades of combat told him these men were a threat, plain and simple. They'd broken into his home. They'd threatened his family. But there were lines Jackson didn't cross until he absolutely had to. Even now, on his knees, back burning from the taser hit, lights in his eyes, he waited, measured. Because when Jackson Riley acted, it meant something. Andy watched everything unfold from the edge of the hallway upstairs. His body was shaking, not from fear, but from the overwhelming tension of knowing something terrible was happening and not being able to stop it. He was only 14, but his build was solid. Years of working out with his dad, playing sports, living under the example of discipline and control. He didn't scream. He didn't call out. Instead, he slid quietly across the floor and ducked into his mother's room. She was sitting against the nightstand, holding Katie close to her chest, whispering that it would be okay, even when her own voice trembled. Andy didn't speak. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. Downstairs, the men spread out like it was their territory. One swaggered into the kitchen and tossed a folded piece of paper onto the counter. "There's your notice," he barked. Jackson looked at it from across the room, blinking away the fog from his vision. It was a single sheet, printed text mixed with handwriting, some official-sounding jargon thrown in, and a crooked seal stamped near the bottom. It didn't even have the family's full name on it. "This isn't legal," Jackson growled, low and sharp. "You think this holds up in court? You think this means you get to break into my house at night?" Another of the intruders snorted. "You don't get it, old man. You've been ignoring warnings for months. We're done playing nice." Andy's pulse quickened. He could hear every word now. His father's voice, firm and cold. The trespassers, growing bolder. One of them opened the hall closet, rifled through jackets and shoes like he had every right to. Then, without warning, a heavy boot slammed into the dog bowl by the wall. It clattered loudly. Dusty, their German shepherd, barked once and growled, stepping into view from behind the couch. The man didn't even flinch. He lifted his foot and kicked again, this time toward Dusty. Not hard enough to injure, but enough to make a point. "Control your mutt." That was the spark, the match to gasoline. Andy's mom gasped. Katie cried louder. Andy clenched the phone tighter and whispered into it, barely audible. "They're not real officers. They hurt my dog. My dad's been hit. Please hurry." Jackson's eyes darkened. The pain in his body dissolved into something else entirely. Not rage, not panic, something colder, focused. This wasn't about debts. It wasn't about rules. This was power and intimidation. These men were using the name of the HOA like armor, bluffing their way into people's homes with paper badges and manufactured fear, and tonight, they'd picked the wrong house. They weren't facing an old man in gym shorts. They were facing a decorated seal with a steel spine and years of experience dismantling threats in the dark. And worse than that, they were facing a father whose family had just watched their beloved dog be kicked by a stranger wearing a lie. Upstairs, Andy saw it clearly now. This wasn't about dues. It wasn't even about them. It was about what people do when they think no one will stop them, when they believe their targets are too scared to fight back. But Jackson Riley wasn't scared. He shifted his weight slowly. The shotgun was still in his hands. His finger wasn't on the trigger, but it was near, and the man closest to him hadn't noticed the slight rise in Jackson's shoulders. The calm in his face had returned, not because the danger was over, but because he was ready to end it. And in that moment, for the first time since it began, the fear left the Riley family, replaced by something far more powerful: conviction. Andy stayed low, peeking between the rails of the upstairs landing, heart pounding like a war drum in his ears. He watched his father shift, slow, deliberate, like a statue coming to life. Jackson Riley didn't rise with anger. He rose with control, the kind of control that came from years of training, of walking through situations where hesitation cost lives. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing into cold slits. That face, Andy had only seen it during drills when his dad was showing him how to stay calm under pressure, how to make decisions with clarity, even when the world was spinning. Jackson stood fully now, tall and unmoved, one foot slightly behind the other, weight balanced. His shotgun rested against his shoulder, not raised, not threatening, but present, heavy, purposeful. And then one of the trespassers stepped forward. This one was broader, with a buzzed haircut and a fake patch on his vest that tried to mimic official enforcement. He pulled out a pair of plastic zip ties and twirled them lazily in one hand. "Let's just wrap this up," he muttered, stepping toward Jackson with a smirk, clearly mistaking his silence for submission. "No need for anyone else to get hurt, all right, tough guy?" But Jackson wasn't listening, not to the words, not to the fake authority, not to the performance. His eyes moved between the three intruders, their positions, their hands, their weapons, or lack of real ones. He assessed everything in seconds: the living room furniture, the walls, the line of sight. And then he moved, not with panic, not with rage, with purpose. He took a single step back, raised the shotgun slightly, and squeezed the trigger. The first shot thundered into the ceiling, tearing a hole through drywall and insulation. Dust rained down like powder, and the blast echoed through the house like a starting gun in a silent arena. The flash alone sent two of the fake officers ducking behind the couch, hands over their heads. But Jackson wasn't aiming at them. He turned. The second shot fired clean into the leg of the man with the plastic cuffs. The impact sent him sprawling backward with a yelp, crashing into the dining table behind him. The sound was deafening, not just because of the blast, but because it meant something. It shattered the illusion that these men had power here. One of them screamed, "He's crazy! He's shooting!" Another yelled, "We need to go! He's out of his mind!" But Jackson wasn't out of his mind. He was entirely in it, focused, steady. His breathing calm, his stance unmoved. He didn't follow the shot with another. He didn't chase the ones who were scrambling. He just stood his ground, smoke curling from the barrel of the gun. Andy saw it clearly. This wasn't chaos. This was clarity. Downstairs, one of the men crawled behind the kitchen island, cursing under his breath. Another backed toward the hallway, flashlight trembling in his grip. They were no longer invaders. They were intruders who had overstayed their bluff and now faced someone who didn't bluff back. Jackson's voice cut through the tension, low and even. "You forced your way in. You brought weapons. You threatened my family. You kicked my dog." The man on the floor clutched his leg and groaned. Jackson didn't flinch. "You wanted to act like soldiers?" he said. "You found one." For a moment, no one moved. Not the family upstairs. Not the imposters downstairs. The entire house was caught in a suspended breath, held between what had happened and what might still come next. Andy's mom had her arms around Katie, but her eyes were locked on Jackson. There was fear, yes, but behind it, something else. Trust. She knew this wasn't recklessness. This was response, measured, earned. Outside, a distant siren began to rise. Andy's 911 call had gone through. Help was coming. But inside the house, help was already there. He stood barefoot in the middle of the living room, unshaken, unyielding. And the fake officers knew it. They hadn't just lost control. They had crossed a line they didn't even see until it was too late. This wasn't over, but the power had shifted, and Jackson Riley was now fully in command. The blast changed everything. 1 second, the imposters were barking orders, waving flashlights like scepters of control. The next, they were scattering. One man dove through the living room window with a crash, vanishing into the night like a shadow chased by light. Another tore off his makeshift vest and sprinted toward the hallway, boots skidding across hardwood as panic overrode whatever plan they'd had. The third dropped to the floor, covered his face with both hands, and let out a high-pitched wail. Not a warrior shout, but a cry of someone who had never expected real resistance. For a moment, the house was quiet again. Not peaceful, too much had been broken for that, but eerily still. The kind of silence that only comes when the danger has passed, but the aftermath hasn't settled. Dust floated in the air, catching in the beams of flickering light. Somewhere upstairs, Katie sniffled. Andy held onto the banister, still watching, still frozen. Then came the distant wail of sirens. They weren't far. Blue and red began to flash faintly through the curtains. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to shake the air itself. And then it happened. Real officers arrived. A team of 3 came through the front, careful, swift, weapons drawn but pointed low. They moved like professionals, tight formation, clear commands, eyes sweeping every corner. And what they found wasn't what dispatch had described as a break-in in progress. What they found was a man standing alone in the middle of his home. Jackson Riley stood tall, calm, and still. His shotgun had already been placed on the floor, unloaded. His hands were raised, shoulders relaxed, palms open, eyes steady. Not in fear, not in submission, in clarity. His back was straight, posture military perfect. His chest rose and fell with even rhythm. The lead officer stepped forward. Officer Taylor. He was familiar, had been to this house before, a community officer, the kind who knew people by name, the kind who remembered birthdays and high school football scores. He lowered his weapon slightly as he recognized the man in front of him. "Jackson," he said, voice careful but not cold. "You okay?" Jackson gave a single nod. "Family's safe," he replied, tone low but certain. "They're upstairs. I neutralized the threat without lethal force." Taylor glanced at the shotgun on the floor, then at the shattered window, then at the trail of muddy footprints and knocked over furniture. His eyes returned to Jackson. "They show you any IDs?" he asked. Jackson exhaled slowly. "One showed me a badge. Looked like it came out of a vending machine. They dropped a handwritten order on my counter, addressed to my neighbor 2 doors down. No signatures, no warrant, just a fake seal and a bunch of threats." Taylor looked past Jackson, motioned to his team. One officer checked the kitchen. Another headed out the broken window, likely in pursuit of the fleeing intruder. Taylor stayed right where he was, eyes locked on Jackson's. "You fired?" Jackson nodded once. Warning shot into the ceiling, then into the leg of the one who fired a stun device at me. He aimed at my chest. I had no choice. I held my ground. I didn't escalate. I waited, but they didn't back off. There was a long pause, not tense, just quiet. A pause for respect, for understanding. "You did everything right," Taylor said finally, his voice grounded, sincere. "Everything. You protected your home. You de-escalated when you could. You called it before anyone got seriously hurt. That's more than most." Andy stepped out onto the landing above, holding his phone. His hands were still trembling, but there was a look in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not fear, not shock. Something else. Pride. Jackson looked up, met his son's eyes, and gave the smallest nod. Andy nodded back. Downstairs, Officer Taylor stepped toward the dining table and picked up the fake document. He turned it over in his hand, scoffing softly at the cheap paper and smudged ink. "This isn't even the right street name," he muttered. Then louder, "We'll run their prints. Cameras at the corner store probably caught their faces." Another officer returned from outside. One's in custody, trying to hop a neighbor's fence. Said he thought it was a dispute resolution. He rolled his eyes. Jackson lowered his hands. No one stopped him. Taylor gave him space. The red and blue lights danced across the walls, and outside, more units arrived. But inside the house, it was done. The line had been crossed. The illusion shattered. And the man who stood in the center of it all didn't look like someone caught in the storm. He looked like the one who had ended it. Morning light filtered through the blinds, calm and golden, but peace didn't follow. Before breakfast, before coffee, before anyone could even rub the sleep from their eyes, the world outside their window had changed. The low hum of engines, doors slamming, voices calling into microphones. The Riley family awoke not to silence, but to headlines. 3 news vans parked at awkward angles on the curb. One reporter stood with a camera crew on the lawn across the street, rehearsing lines while another scribbled in the notebook. Every outlet had a different version of the story, but they all centered on one man, veteran Navy SEAL defends family against HOA imposters, home invasion disguised as dues collection. Hero or vigilante? Suburb divided? Andy peeked through the living room curtain, the side of his face still puffy from a night of no real rest. His little sister clung to their mother in the kitchen, still too young to understand why the world suddenly cared so much about their home. The door had been temporarily repaired, though the frame was still cracked and splintered, like a scar. Jackson Riley stood by the window in silence, watching the chaos unfold beyond his front porch. No emotion played on his face. He didn't wave, didn't react. He didn't want a spotlight. He wanted answers. Calls had come in all morning, from reporters, veterans groups, neighbors, some praising him, others questioning everything. Should homeowners have the right to respond with force? Was it self-defense or an overreaction? What if the intruders hadn't been impersonators? Jackson didn't engage. He didn't need public opinion. He had facts, and facts didn't need applause. That afternoon, just as the sun hit its highest point, a black SUV pulled into the driveway. No media outlet, no badge on the dash, just tinted windows and quiet authority. The man who stepped out wore a plain gray suit, tie loose, eyes sharp. He walked with the posture of someone used to tight deadlines and bigger consequences, the district attorney. Jackson met him at the door. They didn't shake hands. They didn't need pleasantries. The DA looked around the entryway, eyes pausing on the buckled wood near the frame, then glancing toward the family photos lining the wall. "I've seen the footage," he said. "Your neighbor's doorbell cameras caught most of it. We've reviewed the 911 call. Listen to your son's voice as it came in. Calm, clear, precise. Impressive." Jackson didn't speak. The man continued. "We've got the impounded vests, the fake IDs, the handwritten orders. They weren't just pretending. They had patterns. There were other homes, elderly, isolated. You just happened to be different." Silence stretched. Then the DA exhaled and set it straight. "Your house isn't a battlefield, Mr. Riley. But if you hadn't acted, if you'd waited, the people dealing with this today would be homicide detectives, not prosecutors." Jackson finally nodded. "I didn't do it to prove a point," he said quietly. "I did it because no one else was coming." The DA studied him for a long moment. "I believe you." Then he paused, choosing his next words. "But you should know, this isn't over. It'll become bigger than your street. There'll be debates, panels, maybe even legislation. People don't like being reminded how thin the line is between safety and threat." Jackson's jaw flexed slightly, but his voice stayed even. "They broke into my home in the dead of night, disguised as authority. They used fear like a crowbar, and they didn't stop when asked. They made choices, so I made mine." The DA didn't argue. He just nodded once, slow and measured. "If the world had more doors like yours," he said, "we'd be having fewer press conferences." That night, as the sun dipped behind the trees and reporters began to pack their gear, the Riley home remained quiet. No victory banners, no public statements, just a family cleaning up, repairing, resetting, trying to breathe again. Jackson stood alone in the backyard, watching Dusty sniff the fence line like always, like nothing had changed. But everything had, not just in their home, in their hearts, because Jackson didn't feel glory or pride. He felt duty and a sharp, cold anger that anyone had allowed things to get this far. The next week felt like a waking nightmare. What first seemed like a random break-in was soon revealed to be part of a larger scheme. A group of 4 former security guards, fired for misconduct and excessive force, had banded together, posing as HOA enforcers. Everything they used was fake: forged documents, badges printed at home, and uniforms ordered online. They targeted quiet neighborhoods, especially the elderly, demanding payment for bogus violations. One elderly woman on the same street had handed over $5,000 out of fear. No one had questioned them. No one pushed back until they stepped into Jackson Riley's home. His response became a turning point. Within days, federal investigators were involved. Dozens of new victims came forward. People finally realized they weren't alone, and that sometimes the only thing standing between order and chaos is one person willing to fight back. The courtroom was packed. Press lined the walls and notebooks ready, cameras waiting outside. The defendants sat in matching suits, their borrowed dignity crumbling under the weight of the evidence stacked against them. Fake badges, forged documents, testimony from nearly 24 victims. There was no question of guilt, only the formality of sentencing. One defense attorney tried a different route. He stood up, voice soft, hands folded with manufactured humility. "My client didn't mean harm," he said. "He thought he was helping collect debts. He didn't realize the paperwork was invalid. He just wanted to do the job right." The judge didn't blink. A pause, then the hint of a smirk. "Helping?" he repeated. "By threatening families at night? By kicking in doors and waving fake authority in the faces of children? This was no accident. He made a choice, just like the others. And now he'll live with it." 12 years, no parole, each of them. Back home, Jackson didn't watch the trial live. He didn't need to. He knew how it would end. Sitting at the kitchen table, coffee in hand, he watched the news segment with calm detachment. His wife stood behind him, arms crossed, eyes on the screen. "They really thought they could get away with it," she said. Jackson took a sip, shrugged. "They picked the wrong house." She smiled faintly. "They should have just knocked." He nodded, setting the mug down. "Or used their heads." The repairs didn't take long. The broken door was replaced with reinforced steel, the frame rebuilt from the ground up. New locks, new alarms, and just enough scratches left on the wall to remind them of what had happened, but not to define them. Dusty, their loyal German shepherd, was back at his post by the front window, alert and steady, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Andy now trained with his father every weekend. Not just physical drills, discipline, focus, awareness. Lessons passed from one generation to the next, forged not from theory, but experience. Jackson didn't speak much about that night. He didn't have to. It lived in every move they practiced together. His wife, Rachel, found her own way to move forward. She started a small nonprofit aimed at helping victims of HOA scams and impersonation threats. What began as a local support group quickly grew. Stories poured in. People found each other, found strength. Then came the policy change. A federal bill, nicknamed the Riley Amendment, was signed into law. It prohibited any HOA from operating enforcement-style divisions without full licensing, oversight, and proper uniform codes. It didn't erase the past, but it set new rules, new protections. And Jackson's name was in every paragraph of press coverage, though he never asked for it. Weeks later, he was invited to speak at a town hall meeting. He didn't plan to, but when he saw the room, packed with neighbors, veterans, parents, he stepped forward. "I'm not a hero," he said simply. "I'm a father, and a home is a fortress. You come through that door at night, uninvited, claiming power you don't have. Then you've already chosen what happens next." The silence afterward wasn't awkward. It was heavy, real. And then they stood, not for applause, not for show, but because every person there knew he hadn't given a speech. He'd spoken the truth.